Okay, so in this presentation, I just want to look at the ways we've been using three sources of information to try and help us understand and provide different views of the cemetery at Petriplatz. The three things I will look at are stratigraphy, the stratigraphic relationships between the archaeological features, the spatial data, i.e. the location and the form of the burials that we've recorded during the course of the excavations, and then also the absolute dates that we've got for items now, and how those three things can be brought together in geographical information system, computerized mapping systems, if you like, with databases, in order to try and help us understand what was going on. So the first thing to look at is stratigraphy. Now this is an example of a site in London, Spitalfields, which is contemporary, has overlapping periods with that in Petriplatz, and we are using that as a comparison to look at the two medieval populations to see if there are certain features which are similar or to contrast them and so forth. This excavation in London came up with roughly 10,000 skeletons. But the important point to note is that they all occurred in about 2 to 2.5 meters of stratigraphic depth, i.e. that's the distance we went down on average over the whole area. Now, when we try and understand sites like this, we have to break them down into their smallest possible components, and they are the features that we excavate. We call these things contexts. So if you imagine a simple pit, and it might have three distinct fills, and it might have a lining, and it might have the pit cut itself. Now all of those things are given separate numbers, which we call contexts, since they all represent separate events. Someone once cut a pit, someone once put a lining in that pit, someone once put that first fill in, and the second and the third, and so forth. So when we record stratigraphic relationships, what we're interested in is the relationship between each of those contexts, not their physical relationship, not the fact that they touch each other solely, but rather what came before the next thing. It's a relative chronology, not a physical set of relationships solely. It's been said that stratigraphic relationships are the only unequivocal data set that we get from archaeological sites. So it's important to understand this concept. Little example for you. Let's say I'm walking along the road. I happen to have in my pocket a Roman coin. I drop it on the pavement. I put my foot on it to stop it flying away under the cars. Freeze that moment for a second. You have a foot on a coin on a pavement. They've all got different absolute dates. The foot 1965, the coin AD 43, the pavement 2019. That is irrelevant for that frozen moment, for that event, that context. The important issue in terms of the sequence, in terms of the narrative, is that the pavement was there first, then there was the coin, and then there was the foot. That's the extracted stratigraphic information about that event. And when we're understanding archaeological sites, this information is crucial to understanding how the site came together, the phasing of the site, the sequencing of the site, and ultimately the narrative of the site. Okay, so in this presentation, I just want to look at the ways we've been using three sources of information to try and help us understand and provide different views of the cemetery at Petriplatz. The three things I will look at are stratigraphy, the stratigraphic relationships between the archaeological features, the spatial data, i.e. the location and the form of the burials that we've recorded during the course of the excavations, and then also the absolute dates that we've got for these items now, and how those three things can be brought together in geographical information system, computerized mapping systems, if you like, with databases, in order to try and help us understand what was going on. So the first thing to look at is stratigraphy. Now this is an example of a site in London, Spitalfields, which is contemporary, has overlapping periods with that in Petriplatz, and we are using that as a comparison to look at the two relative medieval populations to see if there are certain features which are similar or to contrast them and so forth. This excavation in London came up with roughly 10,000 skeletons. But the important point to note is that they all occurred in about 2 to 2.5 meters of stratigraphic depth, i.e. that's the distance we went down on average over the whole area. Now, when we try and understand sites like this, we have to break them down into their smallest possible components, and they are the features that we excavate. We call these things contexts. So if you imagine a simple pit, and it might have 3 distinct fills, and it might have a lining, and it might have the pit cut itself. Now all of those things are given separate numbers, which we call contexts, since they all represent separate events. Someone once cut a pit. Someone once put a lining in that pit. Someone once put that first fill in, and the second and the third, and so forth. So when we record stratigraphic relationships, what we're interested in is the relationship between each of those contexts, not their physical relationship, not the fact that they touch each other solely, but rather what came before the next thing. It's a relative chronology, not a physical set of relationships solely. It's been said that stratigraphic relationships are the only unequivocal data set that we get from archaeological sites. So it's important to understand this concept. Little example for you. Let's say I'm walking along the road. I happen to have in my pocket a Roman coin. I drop it on the pavement. I put my foot on it to stop it flying away under the cars. Freeze that moment for a second. You have a foot on a coin on a pavement. They've all got different absolute dates. The foot, 1965. The coin, AD 43. The pavement, 2019. That is irrelevant for that frozen moment, for that event, that context. The context that we're looking at, the important issue in terms of the sequence, in terms of the narrative, is that the pavement was there first, then there was the coin, and then there was the foot. That's the extracted stratigraphic information about that event. And when we're understanding archaeological sites, this information is crucial to understanding how the site came together, the phasing of the site, the sequencing of the site, and ultimately the narrative of the site. So a good way to understand the stratigraphy a bit more is to think how it's depicted and how we show it. These are examples of what we call stratigraphic matrices, and they are a diagram in which the relative relationship between the excavated contexts is shown. Each of the boxes represents a context, and each of the lines represents a stratigraphic relationship between those contexts. So to take an example, we can see here that context 1 has a stratigraphic relationship with 2, 3, 6, and 4. An example of this may be where you've got perhaps 4 pits, separate pits that don't impinge on each other, so we don't know which of these was the latest, but over the lot of them is a big dump layer of material that has sealed them all at the same time, or a one-to-many relationship, if you like. Further down the matrix, down here, 43, 44, 48, and 46, they are all overlaying context 47. So the scenario here may be that there was a layer of material into which these 4 pits were dug. Again, the relationship between these 4 pits, the stratigraphic relationship, we don't know. We don't know which one of these was the latest or the earliest, but we do know that they all cut into the same material, so they were all preceded by 47. Another feature to bear in mind is that the matrix demonstrates the relationships between distant contexts. So for example, if we take context 27, we can say that every single one of the contexts above it has it as an ancestor. There is therefore a relationship between all of these. 2 is over 27, 4 is over 27, etc. And we know that because we can traverse up the matrix to get to these things. There is a route to them. Moving to the second diagram, this is illustrating one of the issues that we have on archaeological sites, which is that different contexts have different types of material associated with them. On medieval cemeteries, we're very interested in the dating of the site and the phasing, i.e. which groups appeared before others, what was going on, how the cemetery was used, and so on and so forth. So if you imagine the red dots on this diagram indicate those contexts which had dating material, we're very keen to use those 2 bits of unequivocal information we've got, the stratigraphic relationships between contexts and then dating material, and specifically the fact that if the relationships are correct, then we know that whatever is underneath something must have occurred earlier. So when those events have dates, we can use those dates to try and date the things above them. They give a date by association to everything that's above them. Now typically, if we've dated something, we will give it what's known as an early date or a terminus post sequem. So if you imagine this context down here had a TPQ of 1500, then we know everything above it must have been 1500 or later. Now it could all have come into being in 1501 for all we know. However, we can use that information to help us identify the possible dates that we have for the intervening events which are undated. So in this case, all the nodes without any red dot against them do not have a date at the moment. But we can use these relationships, we can use our TPQ to try and give these things a date. Moreover, when you have a relationship between 2 contexts which have a date, we can say, well, if this has, for the sake of argument, 1500, whereas this one here has a date of 1550, then we know that the dates of the intervening contexts must be between those 2 ranges on the basis of the quality of the dating information we've got. So with that idea in mind, if you consider this third diagram, we are able to carry out what we call propagation of dates up the matrix. So we use the successive stratigraphic relationships between contexts, and we take the date that a context gets from its material and say, well, if the context above me does not have a date, let's give it my TPQ, but perhaps plus a certain number of years, so we can model what we think is going on in the cemetery. So for example, in this case here, we have got a dated context in 21, and we've said, right, we'll give the one above that a date of whatever, 15, let's say this is 1600, 1610, then we'll give that one 1620, and we give that one 1630, because we know that this one here has a TPQ, a dated TPQ of around 1640. So this allows us to play with the data we've got using the best information we've got about the relationships and about the date in order to populate the matrix with more information. A couple of other things about this slide and about the way we use matrices are worth pointing out here. This is a very simple example of a matrix. Often we're dealing with these things that have thousands of relationships within them. And obviously it gets very complicated and quite time consuming to understand what's going on and indeed to process such features. So one method we came up with to try and make this easier, we christened squashing. Essentially this means reducing the entire matrix to a simplified version where the relationships are maintained, but it only consists of contexts which have a certain trait. So in our example here, perhaps just those contexts that had dates, or more typically on this particular project, just those contexts which were burials. So we can reduce this matrix, if you imagine each of these red dots was a burial for a moment, to this matrix here. It's still controlled by the stratigraphic relationships. You can see that these 4 here actually just are shown here, so that it's just as correct and rich as the stratigraphic relationships, but it simply consists of those with burials. Now that's very useful when you want to do a lot of interburial comparison, comparing what the most proximate burial in relative terms above above another had, and the characteristics of that compared with the one below it, and so on, to look at changes over time and so forth. Another element that is worth mentioning here is that when you start dealing with very complicated matrices, you have to consider that the diagrams we've been looking at just then are 2D representations of a 3D problem. All of those contexts appeared in the real world, and they have 3D information. They have an X and a Y and a Z. Now, when you take a 3D problem and project it onto a 2D plane, there will be some data strain. That data strain is shown by the lines hopping over other lines in order to avoid the assumption that they are actually related. So in this case here, you can see there's one here and there's one here. So what that means here is that 651 is not related to 639 at all, but it does have a relationship to 610. A great deal of computing time has been spent trying to solve this problem, but it's an intractable one for 2D projections when the archaeology gets too complicated. The answer to this problem is to relate the stratigraphic information to the actual surveyed location of features, such that one can create a 3D matrix, of which there is a still here. It may look like a maze, but you can essentially see what's happening. All the blue points are contexts which have been excavated, and their center points from the spatial survey data is used to project them in 3D space, and the green lines are the stratigraphic relationships between those features. And if you imagine this in a geographic information system where we have all the other information about those contexts shown, that allows us to ask for certain types of pathology. Show me where all the infants were in the matrix, and you can look at that in 3 dimensions. You could revolve this whole model in order to see if there was any sort of groupings going on in a 3D space. Now, what we have here is a representation of the Petriplatz data, or a part of it. Let's explain this. So what we have here, each of these dots represents a burial. So we've taken our stratigraphic matrix, we've squashed it, as I explained, to just leave a matrix that consists of burials. You have to imagine you're looking at the site side on. You're halfway down through the earth, and you can see these layers of burials in front of you. And the height of these burials is a stratigraphic height. In other words, it's the number of events from the top. Conventionally, we call these things tree levels. So 1, 2, 3, you're going down the depth of the tree levels. And just like chronology, this is an absolute height. It does not mean that these things were laid out in perfectly flat lines like this. It's an abstraction, stratigraphic height. And what we've done here is we've carried out that example of propagating dates up the matrix. And you can see the results here. So if you take this group of burials here, which were all at the same tree level within the matrix, they had a date, a rough date, stratigraphic terminus postquem of 1500. But we've decided to say that these items, which were undated themselves, but must have been later than 1500, we're going to add an increment of 5 years for each group. So we can see that the ones here have been given 1505 above the base of 1500. These ones here, 10 years later, there's 1515, and you go up further on, and these ones here have been given a date of 1535. So it gives us a chance to give some character to the matrix, to give some character to the site that may help us trying to understand what was going on. Now, we're talking here about a 3D problem, as I mentioned. And one of the ways in which we can get rid of that data strain caused from presenting a 3D complex object in a 2D space is to use the actual 3D location of these features. Now, on the left, you can see the survey data that were captured about each of the burials. And if you take this one here, you can see that this poor person just had a pelvis and 2 long bones here, and the outline of the grave cut here. Some of them were a little bit more complete. The round points represent the shorthand for skulls. And what we can do within our geographic information system is we can apply routines which will take the spatial attributes of a given context. So if we look at this example here, all these lines representing the pelvis, the long bones, and indeed what look like remnants of arm bones, these would have all been recorded with the same context number, and they've all got a X and Y location. As you can see, they're planned. And what the GIS is able to do is take all of these different bones from context 96, whatever it is, and say, well, what's the center of gravity? What's the center point? What point amongst that group of things would most accurately reflect the middle of them? And we give it a single point. So we have a single XY point that we can start playing with. Now, as we recorded these things in 3 dimensions, we've also got a Z value for that point as well. So we know how high it actually was in the world. But as I said at the beginning, that's of limited use when you've got such a density of burials packed into such a shallow space. So the other height we've got is what we mentioned in the previous slide, that of stratigraphic height. So what we've got in this image here is another view of the cemetery data, which is incorporating both the X and Y. So you can see these are different shapes, and we've got things presented in 3 dimensions. The stratigraphic depth is used to provide the Z value, but then we've also brought in an absolute detail about the dates themselves, which we've derived from the sparse dating material we have had, and by its propagation up the matrix using the mechanism I just explained. So we're combining 3 lots of information here, the XY from the spatial, the Z from the stratigraphy, and the absolute dates from the finds which have been propagated. Now, another view we can take of all this is to imagine coming from looking at the burials as if you were underground looking across them in section to looking down on them. And this is quite a useful way, again, to understand the site. A lot of this is about producing different views of the same data to try and really understand and get under the skin of what was actually going on. And with these modern GIS systems we're using, it doesn't take long to create these views. So it's a case of sort of looking to see whether there's something relevant or interesting or poignant about whatever it is we're looking at. So what this slide is showing is, if you imagine the stratigraphic depths that we saw, there will be some parts of the site which burials were more intensely laid down, and other parts of the site where there were a relatively shallow depth of burials. That will be manifest by burials in a certain area only going down so many tree levels. So this image indicates by the size of the dot and the color how deep burials were within this cemetery. So these ones up here might have been just a couple of stratigraphic depths down. They might have been the first things that were come across once the slab was removed and the archaeology could be seen. These ones over here, much deeper. So there are many intervening events going down here. So these are obviously going to typically be very, very much older. Not always, but typically, because they are buried by so many events that are above them. And once you've got information about the depth of these things, you can start asking some interesting questions. For example, why is there such greater depth relative to the things around them in these isolated spaces here? What is the reason for all these burials down here? Obviously, we're at the east end of the church. That could be significant. What's the reason for the gaps? Why is there something in there? Is that an archaeological reason? Is it a modern truncation? Maybe there was some sort of services going in through here, we don't know. What about these clustering around the east end? Is that of importance? Yeah. So there's various questions that these sorts of presentations pose, which we can look at in more detail. So moving away from the stratigraphy for a moment, let's consider some of the other data sets that we've got. So being cemeteries, both Petriplatz and St Mary's Spital in London have had a lot of osteological analysis done of the population. Various pathological indicators have been identified, and there are a number of interests here. Vertebral joint disease, bad backs. People in London tended to have bad backs, more so than in Berlin. Trauma, injuries, violence. There was more of that going on in London. Dental calculus, which is an indicator of carbohydrate-rich diets, and poor dental hygiene. People had worse teeth in London. Iron deficiency anemia, so lack of iron in the diet, but that's often a proxy for parasitic infection or blood disorders. Or catastrophic burials. What are catastrophic burials? Periods of catastrophic burial are instances where there is a far greater rate of death than would normally be expected for a normal population. All of these items can have a spatial element to them. They can be identified in terms of groupings over time or over space, depth, areas of the cemetery, and so forth. So to take one example to illustrate this, we can look at catastrophic burials and see what we did at London. From the Spitalfields site itself. So this is a reconstruction of the Augustinian Priory, founded in the 12th century and extending till the dissolution in 1536, 1539. This became one of the largest monastery hospitals in England and includes a 14th century chapel and charnel house here, and what's called the pulpit cross, where people would come to listen to sermons out in the open air. Catastrophic burials were found at this site and were found to cluster in particular areas. So this is the chapel and the charnel house that you just saw, and you can see there's a great density in this area here, which we can put a heat map onto to show that more graphically. This is a real density. It's not caused by lack of visibility or that certain areas weren't excavated as much as others. This area here is less to be trusted because of a large slab that was here under the buildings that were removed for the building of this on this site. But the fact that there are certain numbers of catastrophic burials, that they form a certain percentage of all the burials, is one bit of information, but where they are spatially is another bit of information, and it deserves to be described and understood and any causal reason determined. Another one to look at is a combination of osteological data, in this case the aging of the burials and their distance from certain monuments of interest. So what we have here is the plotting of burials which are solely within a certain distance of the pulpit cross and its remains and the chapel, the 14th century chapel. So within the GIS, this allows us to do what are known as buffer queries, which is effectively like drawing a buffer of a certain distance, I think it was 5 meters in this case, around the outermost outline of the feature, and then saying show me anything that falls within that area. We can then look at the information about those burials that we have in the GIS, and here we're looking at the age information, and we can get a profile of what was going on here. And in this case, we can see that within 3 meters of the monument, the blue blocks here, there is a disproportionate number of very young buried in these areas. The typical distribution, the normal distribution, if you like, of the age of death within this cemetery is shown by the red mark. So you can see this is an unusual, this is atypical. There's a systematic bias here. This is something that needs to be explained. And of course, it is fairly well documented that the unbaptized would often be buried in places considered holy within such site. Same question thrown at the Petriplatz dataset. This is just a simple example showing that on the basis of the osteological data of age, where they're appearing. And here you see, well, there is something going on here, perhaps right by the northern part of the church, but there's also fairly well distributed over here. Again, remember, this is just in 2 dimensions. There might be some there might be some depth information here which is of importance. Maybe these are all very early and everything else is later. Something that needs to be investigated. Another thing to consider in these cemeteries, which has proved quite useful in other sites, is the orientation of graves. Now, we're not solely talking here about orientation as a proxy for the faith of the person who's buried there, with Christian burials being east-west, for example. It's something more subtle than that. It's using orientation to try and understand if there was any agency that this is a document of within the cemetery. It's using orientation to try and understand how the cemetery was used and whether there are certain features of the cemetery which the orientation provides a telltale sign of. This is an example of another medieval church from London, St John's in Stratford, and one can see here that the burials closest to the church, they're fairly well east-west aligned, as you'd expect. But as you come up against this boundary here, you can see them curving away. Now, if we didn't know that boundary was real and medieval and contemporary, we would think, well, why would they be doing that? There must have been some form of restriction at the time these burials went in, which caused the burials to slightly change their orientation as they went round. So orientation can be an artifact of certain decisions made in the past about the way the cemetery was used. So how do we do that? This is similar to the data you saw previously. It's the spatial data captured about each burial, and in the previous example we were calculating a center point of all the bones and the outline belonging to each burial, such that we had a XY point to refer to it by, a sort of spatial shorthand if you like, rather than having all the detail of every single bone. With orientations on Petriplatz, we wish to get a rough idea, start off with a rough idea of what the orientations were doing in different parts of the cemetery, whether that had any relevance in terms of space, in terms of stratigraphic depth, and so on. And the most expedient way we decided to do that was simply to take the longest axis of each burial, generally defined by the cut. So most, but not all burials, had their own cut, and this really defined the orientation of the burial. On previous examples, we'd calculated a center point for each bone and then ran what we call a regression line or a trend line through all those points to come up with as good a line through the middle of those points as a human being would have drawn. So the Petriplatz technique was slightly simplified, and it allowed us to generate very quickly the orientation of most of the burials, not all of them, but as I say, we're interested in the general trend at the moment. So once we did that and applied that to the spatial data set in Petriplatz, it actually produced quite an interesting result. Now, the image rather speaks for itself, and the interesting thing to note, and this is a very good example of why such graphical data exploration is so useful, that you immediately see a question. You can put it into English. Why do the ones here have such a different orientation to everything that's going on down here? Are these earlier? Are these later? What's the reason for this? Other little things start popping out. What's the reason for these very atypical burials at a very different angle to their surrounding features? What was going on here? Are they later? Are they earlier? Are they truncated? Is there a physical reason that they're like this? This little example here is shown in more detail here, and you can see what's happening. You would imagine that this is going to be two burials separated by a great distance in time, because there was no attempt to try and align them in any way when the burials were made. So I hope that's given you a flavour of some of the techniques and methods we're using to try and understand these complex data sets and some of the problems that we face. An interesting avenue of research that we are currently looking at is to use the stratigraphic relationships that we talked about in the first half in combination with the detailed dating we're getting from carbon-14 dating. The potential exists there for us to use the stratigraphic facts about what was before what in order to refine those C14 dates slightly and try and get a better picture and a more accurate propagation of dates up the matrix. So our phasing becomes more accurate and we get more nuance within the symmetry and how it is used over time. Thank you for listening.